This is Fat to Fierce. Welcome to the Confidence Chronicles. I'm your host, Amy English. Join me on this empowering adventure towards a healthier relationship with food, body, and self, one delicious bite at a time. Welcome to the Confidence Chronicles. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you're having a good week so far. So today, we're going to focus on the power of language around food. Because the way we talk about food, it matters. Our words can significantly impact our relationship with both food and ourselves. Early on in my journey to stop stress eating and develop healthier habits around food, I learned a concept that completely changed my perspective. And that is the power of food language. This might sound a bit surprising, but the words we use to describe what we eat have a profound impact on how we feel about ourselves and the choices that we make. In the last episode of the Confidence Chronicles, we talked about rewriting your food story. And we talked about how understanding your current relationship with food can help you change your relationship with food. Well, today, we're going to explore how the language we use around food can hold us back and make it really challenging to change the relationship with food. And I'm also going to offer some alternatives. So stay with me. All right, let's dive in, shall we? So, have you ever noticed how you talk about food? We often describe food as good or bad, where the healthier options, get a pat on the back, but those sugary treats and fatty foods get relegated to the naughty corner. What if I told you this language is actually hindering your relationship with food and maybe even yourself? Because here's the problem with the good-bad food binary. It assigns a moral value to something that is essentially fuel for our bodies. Think about it. A plate of veggies gets a gold star while a slice of cake gets labeled as a villain. This creates a situation where indulging in bad food makes you feel bad about yourself. How many times have you said or heard somebody say, "Oh, I ate that cookie, that was so bad," or "I shouldn't have had that piece of cake, that was really bad," or here's one of my favorites that I used to say all the time, "I ate really bad today." Sit with that for a second and think about how that feels. Maybe you have a sentence that you say often when you're talking about the food choices you made or the way that you ate. You know, on a day where I would eat really clean, I ate really good today. But then, goodness gracious, if I kind of veered off the rails and, indulged in too many sweet treats, I was really bad today. That doesn't feel good. First, it puts us into extremes, right, of good and bad. But then also, when we're talking about how bad we ate, shame sets in and guilt takes over. And when that happens, it makes it really hard to break free from the unhealthy cycles. So what happens is the shame and the guilt, they lead to an unhealthy emotional connection to food. The extremes do this too. So when we're looking at, food being good or bad, and again, we're not talking about taste here. We're talking about this moral value we're assigning to food. And when that leads to shame and guilt, it can make it really difficult to make balanced choices. And then that only increases the stress and the negative self-talk around eating. it just makes it all worse. And then we get put into this negative spiral, this negative thought spiral that just keeps fueling the cycle. And then we're faced with, why bother? What's the point? I'm so bad. Yada, yada, yada. That just keeps everything spinning. So categorizing food as good or bad, while it's common, it's problematic. It's not useful. And all the negative self-talk that comes with this makes it really hard to know you can trust yourself, which is a whole other issue when it comes to making food choices, because that is one of the things when it comes to stress eating and other forms of emotional eating and or binge eating. One of the things we think we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust ourselves around food. We can't trust ourselves to make food choices. Food choices that we feel good about. So you can see how all of this ties in. We're talking about specifically today is changing the language. So how can we do this? How can we shift our food language and create a more positive relationship with eating? So the first step, by the way, you might want to grab a notebook and a pen to write some of this down. Or listen, you could always go back and re-listen to this too. So there you go. But I'm going to go into some of the alternatives and possible new approaches that you could play with, okay? So the very first step is to move away from the moral labels around food. We want to start by removing the words good and bad when it comes to food. Now, again, we're not talking about taste here, okay? Good and bad is still going to apply when it comes to taste. We're talking about the moral code around food, assigning good to veggies and bad to cookies, okay? We want to remove that language when it comes to the food. Instead, focus on the function of food. Is it fuel or is it enjoyment? Is it providing you with energy for the day, or is it a delicious treat to be savored? Come up with neutral terms to describe different food categories. I'm going to share with you the words that I use to describe food. So instead of good and bad, I just kind of erased those words from my descriptors of food. And I use power food and pleasure food. So these are the two categories I like to use. This is what I was taught as I was learning, and this is what I share with my clients. So when you think about power foods, those are your lean proteins, your veggies, your fruits, your least processed foods, kind of the things they talk about, like the outer area of the grocery store, right? So your fresh produce, things like that, lean proteins, fruits, all that good stuff. Those are power foods. And then pleasure foods are the more indulgent type foods, your desserts, pizza, French fries, cheeseburgers, that kind of stuff kind of falls into the pleasure food category. So when I changed the language to power food and pleasure food, a couple things happened. One, it removed the moral code. It removed the good and the bad. It removed that dynamic from my language in describing food, which changed the way I felt about the foods that I ate. There was no longer like, that was really bad to have that cake. No, it was just I chose to have some pleasure food today. I chose to have a piece of cake. I wasn't bad because I decided to have a piece of cake. It was just deciding to have a pleasure food. You see the difference? It feels so different, okay? So I invite you to consider what words you would like to use, neutral terms to describe the different food categories for you. Some people love the language of power food and pleasure food. Some people like to find their own words. You get to do whatever works for you. The other thing is focus on feelings and body cues. Now, it can be really telling to notice how certain food leaves you feeling. A lot of times, for the purpose of this, the rest of this episode, I am going to refer to food as power food and pleasure food, okay? And it can be really telling to notice the way you feel when you're eating more power foods versus more pleasure foods. For me, as an example, when I eat more power food, like the lean proteins, veggies, fruits, etc., I feel better. Physically, I feel better. When I eat more sugary, sweet, listen, I love cake. I've done an episode and I've talked about my love for buttercream icing, all right? That is definitely a pleasure food. But when I eat that, I don't feel good physically. I feel heavy. I feel sluggish. The sugar impacts me. And the sugar impacts me now even more because I have significantly reduced sugar in my diet. And so my body is even more sensitive to it. And I think age has something to do with this too. The older I get and as I move through perimenopause, I think sugar just impacts me in a really interesting way that just doesn't feel good. And the same is true of alcohol as well. I just simply cannot drink alcohol anymore because it just leaves me feeling terrible. Okay, anyway, that was a total side note. My point, power food, pleasure food, understanding the way that each of those leaves your body feeling can be really helpful. Recognizing when you feel satisfied, energized, heavy, sluggish, and just paying close attention, because then you can decide how much of each works for you. Here's an interesting concept that I share with a lot of my clients when they start working with me. Okay, I'm just going to get into this here because why not? All right, we take a look at the ratio of power food and pleasure food in the diet. Okay, so as an example, someone may come and start working with me and they might have an 80-20, meaning 80% of the time they're eating pleasure foods. Again, those are your indulgent, rich, sweet, fatty foods, right? So 80% of the time they're focused on pleasure food, 20% of the time they're focused on power food. Now, very important here, there's no judgment around your current ratio, right? We don't want to start shaming ourselves for the ratio of power food to pleasure food because that's not going to be helpful and it's not going to get you anywhere. So let's say client comes to me, they're an 80-20 right now. And they notice they don't feel good. This in stress, listen, when it comes to stress eating and other forms of emotional eating, it is very rare that we're reaching for power foods, okay? I don't think I've ever known anybody to binge a bag of broccoli. I mean, maybe there are people out there who do, but it's more common that we're stress eating cookies, brownies, chips, things that tend to be more of the pleasure foods, okay? So, end rant. When we are looking at the ratio of foods, what we want to do is recognize how these foods leave us feeling. And the whole point in what we work on in private coaching is changing that ratio. Because this is really important. I'm totally off script at this point, and that's okay, but here's the deal. There is room for everything. There is room for every kind of food that you want to eat. The whole idea is to understand how it feels in your body and how you want to feel so that you can determine how much of the power food and the pleasure food you want to eat. So when a client comes to work with me and they're realizing that, wow, like 80% of my food choices fall into the pleasure food category, and I notice that I feel really bad most of the time when I'm eating, I would like to switch this. We start by changing it little by little. So instead of an 80% pleasure food, we work towards a 70% pleasure food, to a 60% pleasure food, to a 50% pleasure food, until you get to a place where it feels really good for you. Again, this is all part of you being in the driver's seat on your journey and you taking your power back from food so that you get to determine the ratio that works best for you in your body. That's what this is all about. And this is why, we are so used to listening to gurus tell us what we should be eating and how we should be eating. That strips you from your power. Understand the ratio that works best for you, and you can determine how you want to eat. Because that's the other thing. Your body is always going to be a guide. Your body will let you know how it feels when you eat certain foods, and it's also going to help you decide what types of food you want to eat if you're willing to listen. Listening to how your body feels when you eat power foods versus pleasure foods. Okay. And also listening to the hunger and the fullness cues. I mean, that's a whole other topic that I'm not going to get into on this episode, but I will in future episodes, okay? Just your body is such an important guide in this process of unraveling the relationship with food and yourself, and just reconnecting with your body and learning to work with your body as a guide, as a friend. It can be so powerful. Okay, let me bring it back for a second. So we want to remove the words good and bad when it comes to food, finding words that work for you. I offer power food and pleasure food if you find that helpful. We want to focus on the feelings and the body cues, noticing how food leaves you feeling, listening to the hunger and the fullness, and really cultivating a sense of self-compassion. And here's where this falls in. So accepting those occasional indulgences as normal. It's not a problem. You're not bad because you ate a cupcake. This gets me fired up, as you can probably tell. The more we continue to assign the word bad to food, the harder it's going to be to break the habits that are not helping. Occasional indulgences of pleasure food is completely normal. Forgive yourself for not always making perfect choices. I don't know many people who eat power food 100% of the time. I'm sure they're out there. And listen, if that's you, no shade, no judgment. I think that's fantastic. You do you. It's not me. I enjoy to have pleasure food. It's not as often as it used to be. So let me see here. When I started my journey to stop stress eating, so we're gonna go back in time here for just a second, going back to like 2015-ish, I would say that I was probably around a 50-50. I think that's safe to say. 50% of the time I was eating power foods, 50% of the time was pleasure foods. And that's because I was stress eating a lot. And when I was stress eating, I was choosing pleasure foods, right? Now, today, it's 2024, I'm about a 90-10, meaning 90% of the time I'm eating power foods, 10% of the time I'm eating pleasure foods. That's a pretty significant shift. And the reason for that shift is because I feel so much better when I eat power foods. And my goal is feeling better. I have made feeling better more important than any number on the scale. Okay? Now, I do get on the scale daily, and that's another thing we can talk about in a future episode, detaching, removing the drama from the scale. It's just not a problem for me to step on it every morning. It's just as normal as brushing my teeth. But my goal is not getting to a certain number. My goal is feeling my best. I always want to feel my best. Now, there are times when I will indulge in pleasure food, like last weekend when my husband made a cheesecake stuffed chocolate cake with coffee ganache. Okay, it was delicious. And yeah, I indulged in 2 fairly fairly decent sized slices of that delectable cake. Pleasure food, indeed. A little bit of a sugar hangover came with that, but that's to be expected. Certainly not going to beat myself up about that. Again, it's like making a conscious choice to have some pleasure food, okay? So there's that 10%, right? So I've had clients come to me, as I mentioned earlier, where they're at like an 80-20, where 80% of the time they're focused on eating pleasure food, 20% of the time they're focused on eating power foods, and in the time we work together, that completely flips. Where when we're done private coaching, they're 80% power food, 20% pleasure food, or maybe a 70-30, right? Having those ratios can be helpful because then you get to determine what ratio of power food to pleasure food you want to be indulging in. Again, this is how you take back your power. This is how you take charge of your journey. And I'm not saying that following someone else's meal plan is a bad idea. Not at all. It's just, if you're going to do that, fine. Just understand how your body works and how you feel, and determine what you want to eat based off of that. And if you do want to follow a plan that someone else has created, by all means go for it. Just take a close look and see if it's going to work for you once you know how your body works best. All right? And at the end of the day, you always want to have that sense of self-compassion and understanding, especially as you're working towards changing not only your relationship with food, but the words you use with food and the way that you eat. Because listen, this isn't a light switch. It's not automatic. You're not automatically going to flip the switch and completely change the way you talk about food and the way you interact with food. This is a process. It shifts over time, and it's practice. Practice makes progress in this area. But by shifting your food language, that's our topic today. I've gone in a lot of different directions. Hopefully it's all helpful. By shifting your food language, you can create a more mindful and empowered approach to eating. And as we continue on this journey, on this podcast, my intent is to continue sharing other tools that I have used throughout my, 9-year journey. Wow. Almost a full decade. All right, so here's where I'm going to leave you for today. I invite you to start noticing your own food vocabulary and experiment with more neutral terms. Pay attention to how your body responds to different foods and be kind to yourself throughout the process. Remember this, a healthy relationship with food is not about restriction. It is about awareness, balance, and a little self-love on the side. Thank you for being here today and for listening. And listen, be sure to subscribe so that you get notified every time a new episode goes live. I hope you have a great week. Bye. Are you ready to take control of your eating, embrace your body, and boost your confidence? Then let's get fierce. Start your Fat to Fierce journey today. Go to amyenglishcc.com for more resources and to book your discovery call.